Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, Wil'liam Hall, broadcasting to you live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with episode number 20. Matthew chapter 21, episode 24. Rabbi shake his head like, William, you're never going to get this right. Oh, man, that's okay, though. If we have to get it wrong every week, as long as I've got Rabbi in the studio with me, I am pleased and content. Rabbi Michael Skobac, blessings to you, my friend. Shavua Tov. My gosh, everything. Tov, Tov, Tov. It's so good to see you, Rabbi. How are you?
Yeah, Shana Tova. It's really be a sweet and blessed year for everyone. And, this is the season now where, in Jewish calendar, this is like Command Central. This is the Rosh Hashanah literally means the head of the year. And, it's like the headquarters, really. It's the headquarters of the year. And whatever you sort of get established at this time of the year, that's going to be the direction for the whole year. So we should all have really, really meaningful and productive, healthy, prosperous, and successful years in all of what we do. And it should be really sweet.
Amen.
Yeah.
That's such a wonderful blessing for all of us. And you too, Rabbi. My goodness. I mean, without you and without the other teachers out there, there would still be a lot of people really stuck where we were previously. And, that's definitely not a good situation. So may Hashem bless you and the others who are really dedicating so much time. I mean, today, just for you folks out there, the numbers at the bottom of your screen, you can subscribe to the website. You can like us on Facebook. You can follow the forums page, and Sora will be glad to actually educate you through that. And so today I dropped a bomb on Rabbi Skobac and said, Rabbi, I really need you to come to the forums page. And Rabbi's like so stretched thin. It's like I could just see like that stretch superhero that stretches everywhere or whatever. That's kind of how I pictured you. I'm thinking, I don't know how you're going to pull this off, but at least if you're on the forums page, if somebody wants to address you directly, then they can get your attention. And so thank you for being able and being willing to do that for us. We really appreciate it. And
okay, hopefully it'll go well.
Yeah, I think so too. I really hope so too. So that'd be nice. Well, Rabbi, I'm going to let you get kicked off here. And for all of you who just tuned in, we are on Matthew chapter 21, and this is episode number 24. And one of these days, I will not promise to you that I will get these numbers right, but we're going to have fun with it regardless, and we're going to learn a lot. So as long as we got the Rabbi here to teach us, we'll be good to go. So, you want to recap real fast, just because not everybody tunes in every week, and just kind of give a quick 1 foot variation of what happened last week for us, and then we'll just take off from there. Does that sound okay?
Well, we've been sort of building up in Matthew, and we've been seeing week after week there are certain themes that come back over and over and over again. And one of the main themes that we've seen in Matthew is obviously the presentation of, Matthew is trying to present Jesus as the Messiah of the Jewish people. And he's been playing two major themes, really, two major calling cards. One has been Matthew's claim, Matthew's assertion that Jesus has been fulfilling messianic prophecy, right? That the Hebrew scriptures contain many prophecies that speak about the Messiah to come. And so Matthew has been claiming that Jesus is fulfilling these prophecies. We've not been really impressed with them because, they really have not been very impressive.
Sure.
But the main thing that he's been harping on really has been the fact that Jesus almost routinely is performing miracles, healing people, doing supernatural things, walking on water, doing things that are really quite spectacular. And he never actually spells out, right? He never says ... and therefore he must be the Messiah. But it's the implied message, meaning that the implied message is who else could be doing these things other than the Messiah? And so Matthew and all the gospel writers really come back to this theme, but we've certainly seen it in Matthew that Jesus is sort of verifying his claim to being the Messiah by the miracles that he produces and that he does. We've been analyzing that. Basically, we've seen a few things. Number one, we've seen that in the Hebrew scriptures, it never says that we'll know who the Messiah is because of the miracles that he'll do.
Right.
That's just never given as a criteria. And the main reason is because based upon both the Hebrew scriptures and the Greek scriptures, miracles don't really prove anything at the end of the day, because we know that bad guys can do miracles. We know from Deuteronomy 13 that false prophets can do miracles. We know from Matthew 24, we're going to see it in a few weeks, that false messiahs, we're told, are able to do miracles. We see later in the Christian Bible that the Antichrist himself will do incredible miracles. So miracles basically, are things that every religion in the world is able to claim. If you go, basically every religious group, every religion in the world today is able to claim that, they have miraculous things going on. So obviously miracles cannot really prove anything. But what's interesting is we've seen all along that there has been this sort of attitude that Jesus has, meaning that he's sort of assumed from the outset that, just because he's claiming to be who he thinks he is, that people have to accept him sight unseen and without questioning. He seems to resent, really, anyone that questions who he thinks he is. And we've seen that, really, a true religious leader should welcome questioning, meaning that a true religious leader shouldn't expect people just to follow like sheep unless they really can demonstrate their credentials. And, so far we've seen that, Jesus has not done one thing that the Messiah is supposed to do. And so it's been strange. He's had a strange relationship, we've seen, with the Jewish leaders, because he seems especially hostile to the leadership who he feels are not really giving him his due accord. And that's been another theme that we've seen throughout Matthew, that he has this sort of very adversarial relationship with the Jewish leadership, because, they're not simply acknowledging him for who he thinks he is. We've seen a number of other themes, but at this stage in Matthew now, we're really sort of rounding the bend. And we're coming to the denouement, as we say, the conclusion, the climax, because with chapter 21, they're now coming towards Jerusalem. Jesus has spent most of his ministry in the Galilee, in the north, and really out of the purview of Rome. The Roman authorities were mainly concerned. The capital was Jerusalem, and that's where the action was. And so there was a certain safety being out of sight, in the Galilee, in the north. And even so, we saw that Jesus always took pains to sort of play the cards close to his vest. He didn't try to openly proclaim too much that he was the Messiah. He tried to keep many of the miracles that he did secret. He seemed to intuitively sense that, if the Roman authorities found out that he was prancing around as the Messiah, they'd nip it in the bud very quickly. We saw that, again, back in Matthew chapter 2, where Herod, who just heard this report that the baby was born, the Jewish baby who'd become the Messiah, and Herod immediately, tried to kill this baby, to the extent that Matthew claims he killed every Jewish baby under the age of 2, a baby boy, in Bethlehem and in all the cities around Bethlehem. So clearly, he had to be careful, but now he's coming into Jerusalem in chapter 21. And so here it gets more dangerous. And here he's going to actually come out publicly. There's going to be a sort of a public revelation now. So here there's going to be tremendous danger to his life. And we're going to see that's problematic in the way some of these stories unfold. So what happens here is he comes near Jerusalem. He comes to Bethpage at the Mount of Olives. And then we have, this was your screenshot for this episode, this very famous story where Jesus sends 2 disciples to the village opposite where they are, and he says that they should find a donkey tied and a colt with her. So there's going to be two animals. There'll be a donkey tied up and a colt with this donkey. So Jesus tells his disciples to loosen them and bring them to me. Now, obviously, he must have. There must have been some additional instructions here. I don't think he was expecting them to steal these animals.
Right.
So probably they'd have to ask permission. And he says, if anyone says anything to you, just say, well, the Lord has need of them. Like, I'm assuming that there had to be more going on, because I'm not sure that the owner of these animals is going to just be so happy that whoever this Lord is,
right?
Fine, the Lord needs it, but I need my 50 shekels or whatever. So that's what happens here in Matthew. He sends his disciples to fetch these animals. We'll see in a moment why it's so important to have these animals. And you have more or less the same story told in Luke and in Mark, but in John, he doesn't send disciples. Apparently, he finds the animals himself in John. It's a little bit different there.
I never caught that before.
Oh, well, I didn't spend a lot of time doing this in our studies. I mean, once in a while I pointed out differences, but if you really have an attentive eye, you'll find just many, 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 many discrepancies between the way the Gospels tell all these stories. You have Christian commentaries who labor to harmonize these stories. Sometimes, their harmonization seems reasonable, and sometimes it seems far-fetched. But, it's interesting that here in John, he doesn't send disciples. Apparently, he just finds the animals himself. But in verse 4, the gospel writer says, all this was done that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet, saying. Now, he conflates really two verses here. He says, as was spoken by the prophet, giving the impression one prophet said this, but he really combines one line from Isaiah chapter 62, verse 11, where it does say, tell the daughter of Zion. And then he swings over to Zechariah chapter 9. Where it does say, behold, your king is coming to you, lowly and sitting on a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey. So obviously this sounds a little bit.
Gotcha.
It's a little bit goofy that here there's this known prophecy, and actually it's interesting. Christian apologists are famous for having found 365 prophecies from the Old Testament pointing to Jesus. Some people claim, even over 600 prophecies. The vast majority, over 95% of them, probably even more than 95%, are not messianic prophecies at all. They have nothing to do with the Messiah. But here's one of those rare cases where they actually have identified a real messianic prophecy. This passage in Zechariah chapter 9 is actually about the coming of the Messiah. And it does speak about the Messiah riding on a donkey.
Pardon me, Rabbi. What verse is that in?
I believe it's chapter 9, verse 9.
Okay, got it.
If I remember correctly.
Oh, yeah.
And, but the whole story so far is that, in order to fulfill this prophecy from Zechariah, which speaks about the Messiah riding a donkey, he sends disciples to this town to, pick up these donkeys in order that he should ride on them in order to fulfill this prophecy. I mean, it does strike me as kind of goofy.
Okay, I need to insert a question. I put up, if you don't mind, Rabbi, I'm sorry. I did put up on the screen the King James version of Zechariah 9:9, and it actually does have the extra word "and" in there. Now, I can switch over to the Hebrew in a minute, but it says, just to read Zechariah 9:9, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion, shout, O daughter of Jerusalem, behold, thy king cometh unto thee, he is just and having salvation, lowly and riding upon an ass, and upon a colt, the foal of an ass. So it does look like this is talking about two animals in the English of the King James
Yes, we'll get to that.
Okay, perfect. Sorry.
It does actually seem like it's speaking about two animals in Zechariah. But what I was trying to say is that the goofy part to me, the sort of bizarre part, is that there's so much attention here placed on the fulfillment, of the king who's riding on a donkey. But the truth of the matter is that this really is a messianic prophecy in Zechariah. But the important part of this messianic prophecy is not the riding on the donkey. That's sort of like very, very tertiary. I mean, it's almost like irrelevant. The important part of this prophecy from Zechariah, which obviously Matthew doesn't quote, is the next verse. Let me see if I can pull it up here.
Is it in Zechariah 9:10? Is that what you're thinking?
I think it's going to be verse 10. Yeah.
I'm going to read it out for you.
Where, it gives you sort of the real meat and potatoes of why it is a messianic prophecy and what the nature of the messianic prophecy really is. Meaning that the significant part of the prophecy is not the riding on a donkey. In verse 10, in my translation, I'll eliminate the battle chariots from Ephraim and any war horse from Jerusalem, and the bow of warfare will be eliminated, and he will speak peace to the nations. His dominion will be from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. Meaning that what Zechariah is really speaking about here is not some guy riding on a donkey. What he's describing here is a king. He says a king who will have dominion, who will rule, who will actually be, ruling a nation. And more importantly, not just the ruler of a nation, but ruler of a nation at a time of peace, when war has been abolished and there's peace. And when we go through the Hebrew scriptures, this is one of the major elements of the messianic program. We see it in Isaiah chapter 11. We see it in many other prophecies. This is the real significance of Zechariah's prophecy. Not that some guy is riding on a donkey, because the truth of the matter is that thousands and thousands and thousands of people ride on donkeys. That's insignificant. But you don't have thousands of people who become the king of the nation of Israel, who have dominion over the whole world and preside over a world of peace. So that's, to me, the sort of the blunder of Matthew here, is that he just sort of ignores what is the significant part of the prophecy. Now, what's become famous here is Matthew's apparent misunderstanding of what really is going on in this little piece about the donkey. Because you're right, when you read it in many English translations, even the Hebrew has a sense that the king is riding on a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey. It sounds like the king is riding on two animals. The truth is, when you read the parallel in Luke and Mark, in stories, only one is described. Jesus is only going to be riding on one animal. If we look in the next verses here, starting in verse, I believe it's 6, it says, "So his disciples went and did as Jesus commanded them. They brought the donkey and the colt, laid their clothes on them." So they put clothing on both animals and set him, Jesus, on them, on both animals. And he rides into Jerusalem. Obviously it's pretty awkward, but acrobatic to have to ride on two animals at the same time.
That does not make sense. I mean, it really doesn't.
Well, it doesn't make sense for one simple reason. What Matthew doesn't seem to understand is that in biblical Hebrew there is a style that's called parallelism. I think that it's sometimes called synonymous parallelism, where you'll have a phrase that is repeated. A verse will have basically two parts, and the two parts will basically say the same thing. It will look like two things are being said, but it's really one thing that's being said for emphasis. For example, earlier in Genesis, it speaks about Rebekah, and it says about her, she was a virgin, no man knew her. Well, it's basically two ways of saying the same thing.
Okay.
You could have just said no man knew her. We know exactly what that meant. You could have just said she was a virgin. You know what it meant. But it emphasizes the fact that she has never been touched. And this comes up very, very frequently in the Hebrew scriptures, and that's what's going on here in Zechariah. Now, Luke and Mark seem to have understood this, because in Luke and in Mark, they have Jesus just riding on one animal. But because Matthew doesn't seem to really understand this style of the Hebrew, he awkwardly seems to feel that Jesus was riding on two animals. Now, the truth is, I wouldn't make a federal case out of this, because some Christian scholars try to argue that, no, even in Matthew, he was really just riding on one animal. Some of them say that, the sense of the Greek is that, they did place the garments, so it was garments over both animals, but he really only sat on the garments, but the garments were on the one animal he was sitting on. So they have a little bit of acrobatics to be able to harmonize the passage here in Matthew with the way the story is told in Mark and in Luke, where he's only riding on one animal, which obviously makes more sense. It would sort of be ridiculous to have him riding on two animals.
Can I ask a question on the actual Hebrew? Because as I'm looking at, because I was kind of curious myself as to what the Hebrew says, and again, I don't know the style either, but I do know, just to give them credit for maybe their misunderstanding, it does say chamor va'al. So it says it's writing al chamor va'al, and upon. So it does seem even in the Hebrew, but again, I don't know.
That's what I was saying.
So
The style seems to indicate, right, that it's saying two different things. That's the idea of parallelism, that in a parallelism, you have two things being said, right? It seems to repeat.
Okay.
But it's not two different things. It's really the same thing, meaning it's just basically two ways of saying the same thing. So it's on a donkey, or on a colt, as it's often translated, on a donkey. And then it just gives you another expression for how you would describe
to re-explain it again, right?
Yeah, it's saying the same exact thing, just in different words. So rather than sitting on two animals, it's really just two ways of saying the same thing. And again, Mark and Luke, clearly understand this.
Okay. That's a good point. Otherwise, they would not have written it differently.
Yeah, and also, what would be the point of riding on two animals?
Sure, sure.
That's why, again, it's a very... See, someone that's familiar with this Hebrew style wouldn't make the mistake of thinking that it was describing someone that rides on two animals.
Right.
The thing that's interesting, by the way, and this is a bit of a subtle point, but it seems to pull back the curtain a little bit and expose a little bit of the agenda of the gospel writers, meaning that what you see going on here is that Matthew is telling the story in a way in which he thinks it would have had to have happened to fulfill messianic prophecy. Meaning that you get the impression, and this is sort of like giving away the story here of the gospel writer. He's sort of tipping you off to his methodology, that he may not, in general, Matthew, when he writes his gospel, he may not be actually telling you history. He may not be writing what actually happened at the time of Jesus. What you see happening here is that Matthew is constructing the story. The way he constructs his narrative is that it should line up with what Matthew thinks the prophetic prediction was. So Matthew is not, he's not motivated, he's not really moved primarily by what actually happened in the story of Jesus. He's more motivated by making the Jesus narrative line up with what he thinks Zechariah was saying. It's just that Matthew happens to get Zechariah wrong here, and that's why his narrative is so awkward. But it sort of, it pulls back the curtain. It lets you see that, you know, we should be suspicious that when we read the gospel accounts, you know, are we really reading what happened, or are we reading what the gospel writers assume must have happened because that's what they assume the prophetic story. For example, we'll get this in a few chapters when they speak about the crucifixion of Jesus, right? And the parting, you know, of his garments, and the, you know, feeding him poison, all the details of that story. Did that really happen? Or did they find verses in the Hebrew Bible which they took to be, you know, verses describing the death of the Messiah, and they say, well, if that's what the Jewish Bible speaks about, it must have happened to Jesus. So again, this is just a suspicion. It wouldn't prove that these stories didn't happen, but Matthew is sort of exposing a little bit about how he operates here.
Now, it poses another question, because all the things you brought up are quite fascinating, and it really is triggering other questions as well. I mean, it's been pretty well documented by a lot of the scholars that that Paul's writings were first, then Mark, then then so on and so forth. So if the gospel writers really, if their writings didn't really show up on the scene for a good 30, 40 years after the so-called ascent of Jesus, first question is does it mean that they just surfaced then, and maybe those writings were always around, but they finally got them compiled and said, look, everybody, this is what they wrote 30 years ago? Or was it something you think that might have actually been written 30 years post-resurrection?
Well, this is the kind of question that people spend their lives, in biblical scholarship, in New Testament biblical scholarship, and this is hotly debated. Are there oral traditions? How far back do these oral traditions go? Were there written traditions that were preserved even before the Gospels were written? This is all speculative, and there are many theories as to how the Gospels were initially composed. And it's up for grabs. That you'll find this hotly debated. I mean, you'll have some scholars that date the Gospels quite late, even later than the dates that we normally use, which would be about 70, the year 70 for Mark, the year 80 for Matthew, the year 90 for Luke, the year 100 for John. Some people date them even later.
Right.
It's very hard to know, and there are great divisions between conservative scholars and liberal scholars. So conservative scholars insist, really, I mean, it seems hard to even, it's hard to even imagine, but they insist that, the gospel writers were, these people named Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, who were around in the first century. It's more likely that, these stories were not written by the actual associates of Jesus that had these names, but it was very common, in a lot of the writing back then, for people to write much later, but to give their documents more credibility by just giving it these earlier names. So, again, this is something that scholars very hotly debate, and more liberal scholars just concede that the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that you find in the gospel stories, they had nothing to do with the writing of these stories.
Interesting.
But it's interesting that I looked at, for example, David Stern's Jewish New Testament commentary. David Stern is a
Hmm.
American Messianic Jew who made Aliyah, lives in Israel now. So he recognizes that this is a serious problem in Matthew. And I'll just quote what he says. He says, this problem would impugn Matthew's credibility as a divinely inspired writer. He recognizes that, to sort of misunderstand the actual sense of the Hebrew, would certainly not give us a tremendous amount of trust in Matthew's, credibility. And, he suggests a number of different ways of, reading the passage to sort of save Matthew's accuracy. But again, I don't want to spend too much time speculating, because
Sure.
to me, it really misses the point. The main point for me would not be the number of animals. It's an interesting
Right.
side point. To me, the main point is that, Zechariah is not really talking about animals so much. Zechariah is talking about, a real significant, prophetic,
Right.
change in the world, a really totally different kind of world where there's going to be this, incredible king of Israel who will actually rule. Christians speak about Jesus being the king, but it's just a very ephemeral and imaginary kind of rulership. We're talking about, real live rulership. I think right now as we're speaking, they're having these debates for the Republican candidate of the American presidency. There's someone that's going to sit in the White House and be the commander in chief, and he's going to control, the most powerful army in the world. That's what you talk about when you talk
Mhm.
about rulership. Someone actually controls a nation
Mhm.
and has a nation that actually follows it. Jesus didn't have a whole nation following him.
I just thought of something very interesting thanks to your example with the presidency. Whoever the president is, if they make all these promises, I'm going to, lower taxes, I'm going to increase healthcare, I'm going to do all this stuff, and then I'm going to get in my jet, and I'm going to fly to Washington, and I'm going to tell them, and I'm going to get this in order, and I'm going to build this. At the end of the day, they could care less whether he took his jet or not. They want to know if the results came true.
Very good point.
So you drove that in.
Yeah.
That was good. Very nice, Rabbi.
We'd be just as happy as having a teleconference rather than having to fly somewhere.
Right. Very good.
He could Skype world peace. So going to verse 12, here you have a very famous story of they call Jesus cleansing the temple. It's interesting that, and this is a really big problem in the Gospels, is that you have, I think in John, it must be, I think, chapter 2 in John, you have what many people think is an earlier cleansing of the temple. Apparently, 3 years before this takes place, there's an earlier situation where Jesus, cleanses the temple and drives out the money changers, takes a whip and whips people. Some people try to again harmonize these stories. It's not going to be what we're going to do at this point tonight. But here, I just wanted to make maybe a minor observation that verse 12 says, when Jesus went into the temple of God. So it's interesting that the gospel writer doesn't seem to think that Jesus is God here. He doesn't say Jesus is coming into his own temple. He's distinguishing Jesus from God. And what I think is a little bit inaccurate here is that we know one thing for sure, that these money changers and people who sold the sacrifices, the doves and the other animals, they were not in the temple itself. When you read Matthew, you get the sense that Jesus sort of strides into the temple itself, and he finds all these things going on. That's just absurd. We know that most of these operations took place on Har Hazeisim, on Mount Scopus, and actually there were even money changers, further out into the provinces. They did come closer to Jerusalem prior to the holidays. So this story we know in Matthew 21 takes place just prior to Passover. So they would have been a bit closer to Jerusalem, possibly even somewhere on the Temple Mount, but they would not have been in the temple itself. And I think that is a bit of an inaccuracy here in the gospel story. But the truth is, many people read the story and they assume, that this was a total corruption going on. But the fact of the matter is that there was a tremendous need to have money changers because many people were coming into Jerusalem from outside of Israel. They were carrying not, Jewish, or let's say Israeli currency. They were carrying Roman currency. Some of it actually had pagan symbols on it. And people that were coming to pay, there was an annual tax that the temple took, the Machatzita shekel. So that was taken from what was called a Tyrian silver coin from Tyre. And therefore, people coming from outside the land had to exchange their money in order to get the proper currency to use. So that was totally legitimate. And we know from historical sources that these money changers did take a little bit of a fee. We don't have any evidence that they were ripping people off. However, we do have evidence that there were unscrupulous people who were engaging in the sale of the doves and other sacrifices, and they were, in many cases, ripping people off. We know that the rabbis themselves complained about these people.
I have a question for this.
Yeah.
Is it even a possibility that a single person who, number one, who not everybody was in line with him being the Mashiach, could actually go into a temple and cause all this trouble without getting crucified? Okay, that was not necessary, but without actually having problems, because what authority does he have to go in and start flipping over tables? And how could, it would be like, I kind of picture it be like somebody who is a law-abiding citizen who gets really fed up with all this police brutality, and they go into the police station, they start tearing things up and telling them, you guys need to get your head on straight. They're going to throw this guy in jail. How's it even possible to do that?
The truth is, I neglected to point this out in the previous passage. After he rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, we're told in verse, I think it's 8. I have my printing here is very, very small.
Yeah.
It says, a very great multitude spread their clothing on the road. It wasn't that it just came in to Jerusalem sort of quietly.
Mm-hmm.
We're told a great multitude, not just a few people, and they spread their clothing out on the road. Others cut down branches from trees and spread them on the road. In verse 9, we're told, and the multitudes who went before and those who followed cried out, saying, Hosanna to the Son of David. They're basically greeting him as the king. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. And when he came into Jerusalem, it says all the city, the whole city, was moved or shaken, saying, who is this? And this is the same word, by the way, in the Greek that is used in Matthew chapter 2, verse 3, when it said that Herod was very troubled and all of Jerusalem with him. That somehow his coming into Jerusalem, we're told, shook up the whole city. And then in verse 11, so the multitude said, this is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth of the Galilee. So you're right. We have to appreciate the setting here that, the Romans walked on eggshells. The Romans, the entire world, they conquered so easily in many ways. The only place they had difficulty asserting their authority and their rule was over Israel. Israel was a very tough place to control. The people were very independent-minded, and they couldn't stand Roman rule. They couldn't stand the fact that the Romans had these pagan symbols all over the place. They were offended by the Roman pagan symbols in Jerusalem, and it was always it was like a tinderbox. Jerusalem was always a place that was almost ready to explode. We know that there were, previous to this, from Josephus, and we know from the book of Acts, there were people who claimed to be, either the Messiah or rebels against Rome, and the Romans had them executed and killed. And so the Romans were always very, very wary of people that might be fomenting rebellion, rabble-rousers, people who were claiming to be the king, people claiming to be the Messiah, people claiming to want to assert, Jewish political sovereignty. And so that was something the Romans were always concerned about. But the most sensitive times were during the Jewish holidays, when all the pilgrims came into Jerusalem, because we know again from the Hebrew scriptures that every Jewish male had to come to Jerusalem 3 times a year for each of the pilgrim festivals. And the time when they were the most concerned about revolution was Passover time, because there was a Jewish tradition that just like the Jews are redeemed at Passover, so the future redemption will take place at Passover. So the Romans are aware of the fact that Passover is a very sensitive time, because the Jews are looking forward to being liberated and the huge crowds coming into Jerusalem. So the Romans, we're told, would triple and quadruple their guards. They bring in many, many extra soldiers. They were on the lookout. So how is it possible for Jesus to come into Jerusalem now? And he wasn't coming in by himself. He was coming in with his followers. We're told, we know from the Gospel of Luke, I think it's Luke chapter 24, I believe, that he told his followers to arm themselves, to purchase swords. So they're coming into Jerusalem, a group of people following Jesus, and there were huge crowds screaming out, "Hosanna, the Son of David." They're welcoming him as the King of Israel.
Now that poses yet another issue I'm kind of curious about, and you can feed it in if you got time. The claim, I've heard several claims, and I think it may come from this whole circle, this whole perspective is it possible that Jesus and his followers were Essenes? Because I've learned that the Essenes were very much, kind of out there, and they were very much into, going to war if they need to, and really just kind of off the grid. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that was a theory that was very popular at one point. There are other theories which say no, rather than being Essenes, maybe they were more like the Zealots, the Kanoim.
Oh yeah,
for example, one of his followers is Judas Iscariot from the Sicarii. The Zealots were a very militaristic Jewish group. They were very anti-Rome, and there are scholars that think that at least 2 of Jesus' 12 followers may have been from this group. So there are people, that try to paint Jesus as a political zealot. It's really hard to know. And so I don't want to speculate, but what's clear is that he does see himself as the Messiah. He does see himself as the king. And at least the way the Gospels paint the story, he's got a huge reception of people greeting him as the king. And then, as you just pointed out, he comes into the temple and he starts turning over tables, creating a ruckus. And the Romans don't seem to bat an eyelash. No one seems to notice. And what's peculiar is that it requires somehow later on, we're going to see that Judas Iscariot has to betray Jesus and tell the Romans, here's where you could find him. Why do they need to have an insider tell them where they can find him? He's been very public from the very first step into Jerusalem.
Yeah. And
it's impossible to really imagine how the Romans, would have sort of ignored all of this. They were very, very, very sensitive. So we're going to move on to another very famous story in verse 18, because after he turned over the tables and he made a lot of trouble there, he left and went out of the city to Bethany. He left the city. But then in verse 18, he was returning to the city. We're told he was very hungry, and he sees a fig tree by the road. He came to it and found nothing on the fig tree but leaves. And he said to it, "Let no fruit grow on you ever again." And immediately the fig tree withered away. And when the disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, "Wow, how did the fig tree wither away so soon?" It's pretty amazing. Jesus answered and said to them, "Assuredly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you'll not only be able to do what was done to the fig tree, you'll be able to do this, but also if you say to this mountain, be removed and be cast into the sea, it will be done. And whatever things you ask in prayer, believing you will receive." Obviously, it's hard to understand why it wasn't possible for Jesus to have done the opposite here. Meaning, if he's coming into the city and he's hungry and he wants to eat some figs, and there were no figs on the tree. By the way, in Mark chapter 11, we're told that it wasn't the season for growing figs. Figs don't grow in the spring there. So why does he curse the tree so that it should wither up and basically die? He simply could have blessed the tree that it should grow fruit.
Right.
And what's especially bothersome is that anyone that's sensitive to the Tanakh, we know that in the Tanakh itself, Hashem takes the destruction of fruit trees very, very seriously, to the extent that we're told in Deuteronomy chapter 20 that even in a time of war, not just that, if you don't like the way a tree looks in your backyard, you can't chop down the apple tree, but even in a time of war, in a war, you may have a tremendous need to chop down trees to, let's say, build a catapult, or to build, scaling equipment, or to, use it in the war effort. So we're told in verse 19, this is chapter 20 of Deuteronomy, when you besiege a city for many days to wage war against it, to seize it, do not destroy its trees by swinging an axe against them, for from it you will eat, and you shall not cut it down. Is the tree of the field a man, that it should enter into the siege before you? So this is considered to be actually a very grave sin in Jewish thoughts.
Wow.
The needless destruction of a fruit tree. And here there doesn't seem to be any reason why, if there was a need to do a miracle, just bless the tree, make it produce fruit, even though it's not the season for growing fruit. Now, many Christian scholars take this little vignette, this little story, as symbolic of the cursing of Israel, meaning that in Scripture, the fig tree is often symbolic of Israel. And so many Christian scholars say that just as they say Israel, by rejecting Jesus, shows that it doesn't have any spiritual fruit. So really this story is symbolic of the fact that, Israel is about to be cursed. We'll see this just in a few minutes. Hopefully we'll get to do this before we finish tonight. But again, I just wanted to mention in passing that I don't think anyone has seen any Christian since the time of Jesus be able to take a mountain, pick it up, and cast it into the sea.
Right.
So that seems to be a pretty exaggerated promise. In verse 23, he comes into the temple again, and here the chief priests and the elders of the people confront him as he was teaching, and they said, "By what authority are you doing these things?" Now, it's not clear what they're referring to. It may be that they're referring to the previous events where he turned over the tables in the temple, but they may be referring to his teachings that they heard about, or possibly his miracles, or possibly, again, just to the turning over the tables. But they're asking him, who gave you the authority to do whatever they're worried about? And he, plays it very coy, and he says, well, all Jews answer a question with a question. So he says,
nice.
I'll ask you one thing, which if you tell me, I'll likewise tell you by what authority I do these things. He says, the baptism of John, right? When John the baptizer would immerse people in the Jordan, where was it from? Was it from heaven or from men? Now, it's not clear what does he mean by that. Where was it from? So it seems that what he's asking here is, where did John's authority come from? When John the baptizer would, purify people in the Jordan River, Jesus is asking, where did he get his authority from? Now, you don't really need any authority to immerse people in the, for baptism, for a mikvah. But he's basically asking them, he's trying to get them to declare how they saw John the baptizer. And they reasoned among themselves, Matthew says, saying, if we say from heaven, meaning if we're going to say that John the baptizer was someone who was acting in accordance with, the will of God, then Jesus is going to say to us, why then did you not believe him? Meaning that Jesus seems to be assuming here that none of the Jewish leaders were following John or repenting due to the call of John. I don't know if that's so clear. We know that John was actually extremely popular among many, many Jewish people. So it's hard to imagine that.
I've actually heard a
none of
very
the-
interesting thing that I may, it seems like it's almost agreeable to a certain level, is that some of the followers actually of John may have even thought that he was the Messiah.
Well, we know that many people thought that John may have been the Messiah, not
Right.
just his own followers. Apparently, we know this from Josephus, that John was very, very popular. So I don't know, why Matthew here and Jesus are assuming that, that these Jewish leaders in Jerusalem would be afraid to come out on the side of John the Baptizer. Probably many of them were very fond of him. But this is how he tells the story, that they said, look, if we tell Jesus that John the Baptizer had his authority from heaven, he'll say to us, why then did you not believe him? But if we say that he only got his authority from men, and he really wouldn't need more than that anyway, we fear the multitude on account, because they count John as a prophet. So they answered Jesus and they said, we don't know where he got his authority from. So Jesus said to them, well, then I won't tell you by what authority I do my stuff. Of course, one of the problems here is that we know that in the Jewish world, there were no prophets at this time. Prophecy already ended about 400 years before the Common Era. So when it said previously in I think in verse 11 here in this chapter that many people thought Jesus was the prophet from the Galilee, there were no prophets. No one was considered to be a prophet. Now, maybe they're using the word prophet here non-technically, meaning like, people would say Steve Jobs was a prophet of his time.
Right.
So, unless they're using the word prophet in that sort of loose way, there was no biblical office of prophecy at this point. There weren't people that were prophets. So we're going to move on now to the parable of the two sons. Sort of a strange story here, because apparently, Jesus was being coy with these people and said, look, if you're not going to tell me, where you think John got his authority from, I'm not going to tell you where I get my authority from. But then he seems to go on. And he says, what do you think? A man had two sons, and he came to the first and said, son, go work today in my vineyard. He answered and said, so the son said, I won't. I don't want to go work in the vineyard. But afterward, he regretted it and he went. So he went, at the end of the day, he went anyway. But then he came to the second son and he said, likewise, I want you to work in my vineyard. And the son said, I'll go. But he ended up not going. So which of the two did the will of the Father? Which one is going to be more beloved to the Father? Obviously, the point of this parable is that what you do is more important than what you say. So they said to him, these leaders in Jerusalem, they said, obviously, the first son is more beloved to the Father, even though he didn't want to do it originally. He didn't want to originally work the field, but he ended up doing it later on. So Jesus said to them, assuredly, I say to you that the tax collectors and harlots enter the kingdom of God before you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But tax collectors and harlots believed him, and when you saw it, you did not afterwards relent and believe him. Now, this goes back to a problem we saw earlier in our studies of Matthew. What's this business about believing? The truth is that John the Baptizer was not asking anyone to believe in him. He was asking people to repent, to change their ways. And so is the implication here that after so-called believing John, these tax collectors stopped being tax collectors and the harlots stopped being harlots? Is that what he's saying? Because he's referring to these people now as not former tax collectors and former harlots. He's saying these tax collectors and harlots will enter the kingdom. And so what it seems, it's almost like it's a later Christian idea that all you need to do is believe somehow.
Sure.
Whether you actually change is not that important. So it's a pretty strange story when you read it straight.
Makes me
And
wonder about if a person really, if they believe something, it's going to affect their actions. Whether it's if you believe your house is on fire, your neighbor calls, "Hey man, your house is on fire." "Yeah, I believe you, man." "Okay," and you just sit there watching TV. Or same thing with the doctor. If you really believe the doctor's report that you've got cancer, you need to go do this stuff. Are you just going to sit there and ignore it? Are you going to actually do something? So it does seem
because,
quite
see,
hypocritical.
what we saw was that, in many of the stories we've seen previously, Jesus seems to be expecting people to somehow believe in him, follow him. And it doesn't seem to mean that requires necessarily, although we saw in many stories it did require that they begin, more carefully following the laws of the Torah. But it's one of these issues that sort of we've been seesawing back and forth in terms of Matthew's writings. What's the bottom line here? Is the bottom line to follow Jesus, or is the bottom line to reform your life and follow the Torah? And, Matthew seems to generally be leaning toward the importance of turning your life around and following the Torah. But you have these snippets where, as we said, these are stories written after Paul's teachings became dominant already, and Paul's clearly of a different mindset in terms of the importance of following the Torah versus simply putting your faith in Jesus. So it's to me a little bit of a confusing story. I just want to read a rabbinic parallel to this parable. It's from Exodus Rabbah, for chapter 27. There's a parable of a king who had a field, and he desired to turn it over to a tenant farmer. So he called to the first and said to him, "Will you take this field?" So he said to him, "I don't have the strength. It's too hard for me." So it was with the second, the third, and the fourth. They too did not accept it from him. He called to the fifth and said to him, "Will you take this field?" And he said, "Yes." The owner said, "On condition that you work it according to the Torah." He said, "Yes." But when the tenant farmer entered the field, he left it unworked. With whom should the king be angry? On those who said they were unable to accept it, or on the one who took it upon himself, and having taken it upon himself, left it unworked? Should he not be angry with the latter one? So there is a similar parable told in the Talmud, and we're going to conclude tonight with a very, very troubling, actually, parable, which is the way Jesus ends his interaction with the leaders in Jerusalem. It's the parable of the wicked vine dressers. So he says, "Here another parable. There was a certain landowner who planted a vineyard and set a hedge around it, dug a winepress in it, and built a tower. And he leased it to the vine dressers, and went into the far country. Then when the vintage time drew near, he sent his servants to the vine dressers that they might receive its fruit. And the vine dressers took his servants. They beat one, killed one, and stoned another. Again he sent other servants, more than the first, and they did the same thing to them. The last of all he sent his own son to them, saying, 'They'll respect my son.' But when the vine dressers saw the son, they said among themselves, 'This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and then seize his inheritance.' So they took him and cast him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those vine dressers?" So they, the rulers of Jerusalem, said, when the owner of the vineyard comes, Jesus asked them, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to these vine dressers? So the leaders said to him, he'll destroy those wicked men miserably and lease his vineyard to other vine dressers who will render to him the fruits of their seasons. So now Jesus seems to give a statement, makes a statement which seems to be a non sequitur. He says, well, the stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing, and it's marvelous in our eyes. Now, the way it seems to really have nothing to do with the previous passages, but the way many Christian commentaries take this passage is that in the parable, the landowner is God, and the vine dressers are Israel,
right? And
the servants that come are all the prophets that came to rebuke Israel, but Israel beat the prophets and killed them and stoned them. And then when finally the son comes, which is in the parable Jesus, they kill him too. So Jesus then says to these people that the stone that was rejected, has become the chief cornerstone. What he's really saying is that you rejected the Messiah. Really, you rejected me. It's his way of rebuking these people. Therefore, I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken from you and be given to a nation bearing the fruits of it. And whoever falls on this stone will be broken, but on whoever it falls, it will grind him to powder. Now, when the chief priests and Pharisees heard his parables, they perceived that he was speaking of them. But when they sought to lay hands on him, they feared the multitudes, because they took him for a prophet. So again, you see here how incredibly popular Jesus is among the masses of people. At least, I don't know if he really was, but that's how Matthew tells the story. And again, as we've seen, this is a problem, because, what's interesting is that Jesus tries to use Psalm 118 here as a reference to himself. The stone which was rejected has become the chief cornerstone. The truth is that Jesus was not rejected. In his lifetime, he was incredibly popular, at least how the Gospels tell it. And after his death, he became the most beloved person in history.
Right.
So it's hard to speak about such a person that he was rejected. However, when we really understand Psalm 118, it's not about Jesus. Psalm 118, and especially if you read the Psalm from the beginning, it's about the people of Israel. Now, it is a messianic psalm in the sense that it's speaking about how Israel will ultimately be vindicated in the eyes of the world. So, we always have to distinguish between whether a passage in the Bible is messianic or it's actually speaking about the person of the Messiah. Most messianic prophecies in the Bible are not about the person of the Messiah. They're about what's going to be going on in the world when the Messiah is here. So Psalm 118 is speaking about really the history of the Jewish people. And at the future, obviously this will only happen in the Messianic age, when the world will come to acknowledge the people that they had rejected all along. And what's bothersome about this passage, and I'll conclude with this, is that many Christian theologians, many, take this story really as a key to their replacement theology. When Jesus says the kingdom of God will be taken from you and given to a nation bearing the fruits of it, people like, for example, John MacArthur clearly read this as really speaking about the ultimate replacement of Israel by the Gentile church. Now, you have many messianic commentaries. For example, David Stern, in his Messianic Jewish Bible, is very irked by this. He's obviously very bothered by the possibility of reading this as the replacement of Israel by the church. So he says it doesn't really speak about the replacement of Israel by the church as God's chosen people. He says it's the replacement of the sort of conventional Jewish leaders like the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin. They're going to be replaced by the messianic Jewish followers of Jesus, like the apostles. The problem there obviously is that we know that the messianic Jewish followers of Jesus did not last very long. Meaning that after the year 70, the Jerusalem church, those Jewish people who followed Jesus, many of them were killed when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, and they scattered, many of them going to Jordan. But there was not much left. And we know that this small Jewish group of people who followed Jesus became very quickly eclipsed by Paul's Gentile church, to the point where in the 2nd century already, the Gentile Pauline church, which was very anti-Torah, persecuted the Jewish followers of Jesus. By then they were, in the 2nd century, known as the Ebionites or the Nazarenes. They were persecuted for their following of the Torah. And we know that by the 4th century already, there basically are no more Jewish followers of Jesus. So it's hard to read, as David Stern would like to read. This is a parable speaking about how the rabbis will be replaced by the apostles, when we know the rabbis never died out. They're still here. You're speaking to one. And the Jewish followers of Jesus died out, meaning that we see that God voted, at this stage in history, meaning God made it his plan, his program to preserve the traditional Pharisaic, rabbinic Jewish leadership, meaning that, it wasn't easy for us to survive. It was miraculous. And yet God miraculously preserved the rabbinic leadership of the Jewish people, but God didn't see to it to preserve these Jewish followers of Jesus. What became of the Jesus movement, at least in my opinion, was a very radical departure from Jesus and his teachings with the Gentile Pauline church. So it's a very disturbing passage because, Christians today are very, divided on this question of replacement theology.
Mm-hmm.
Many people in the church, hold to this as a doctrine. Many people are opposing it. And there is ammunition in the scriptures for defending and attacking both sides. But this seems to be a pretty strong passage supporting this really unfortunate doctrine of replacement theology.
Yeah.
So we went over a little bit time tonight. I'm very sorry. But I think we'll bring chapter 21 to a close now.
I'm pretty sure that I speak for everybody watching and everybody who will be watching later. You don't need to apologize for running over. The more we get from you, the better off we are.
Even with my horrible voice tonight.
Hey, you know what? That just proves your dedication. Sick or not, you had the opportunity to take the night off, but you opted out. And so I know that's going to be, that's a great mitzvah for you just to bear in there.
I think as Mike Myers said, I'm very verklempt.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was our beloved Rabbi Michael Skobac. Go to his website, JewsForJudaism.ca, to get more from him. Check out the his YouTube page. If you want to contact him directly with an email, you can go to the website and actually follow the contact us. If you want to donate to their cause, there's a donate button. You can go there and do that as well. I also have manipulated him into joining the Tanakh Talk forums page, which I'm very grateful for. So, don't know he's very busy, so I don't know if he can actually get to your questions, but you can at least put them there. And if you haven't gone to the forums page yet, you should. TanakTalk.proboards.com, and try to do it without singing the melody of the song in your head. It's very catchy. Rabbi, thank you so much, and we will talk to you next week. Shalom, shalom.
Next week might be Yom Kippur.
Oh, you know what it is? Wednesday is, I believe, is Yom Kippur. So in that case, we won't pull anything crazy. We're going to let's take next week off. You probably could use the extra rest anyway, Rabbi. So we will see you all in 2 weeks for Rabbi Skobac. However, there will be more Tanakh Talk events in between. So feel free to check into the website, subscribe to the website, subscribe to the Facebook page as well. Like the page, and you'll get all of the alerts. Unfortunately, you won't get all of Rabbi Skobac, so you're going to have to go to his website to get more of Rabbi Skobac. So until then, shalom, shalom, everybody.
Shalom, be well.
And we'll talk to you soon. Shalom.
והכמיהה